All right, good morning. We're about a minute away from um, getting started. We're letting folks into the second day of the Kentucky Summit on Economic Development Strategies to leverage Kentucky's Riverports and Freight Network. We'll give a couple minutes, maybe one more minute to 10:01 for everybody to get in the door here and make sure everybody's ready for today's session. All right, I'm going to give us about 30 more seconds to, it still looks like some people are jumping in. So let's just be patient for 30 more seconds, get a couple more sips of that coffee, and we'll be with you by 10:02. Well, good morning. It looks like some people are still coming in, but we have a lot to discuss with you today. Want to go ahead and get us started to present to you the second Kentucky Summit on Economic Development Strategies to leverage Kentucky's Riverports and Freight Network. And today we start off with session 4. This session is going to talk to you more about forecasting the future of Kentucky's freight economy. So first I wanted to begin with just a quick overview with Zoom, just for those that may be coming in for the first time today or haven't been on a Zoom call. There's a bar at the bottom that has a mute button. So if you want to practice now, it'd be good if everybody who's not speaking right now has their mute button on, prevent background noise. Also, there's a camera button. So if you have a question, we'll have time at the end for some questions and answers. Sometimes it's best to turn your camera on if you can, just so that we can see you better and get our attention, jump up and down, wave your hands. Also, you can use the chat function in the middle there, a little cloud, to type in your questions. The moderator, myself, will ask the two presenters those questions when we have time at the end of their presentations. Or if you're having trouble or need some help from Haley Taylor with Razor or Rebecca Thompson with UK4. They are the ones to reach out to during this session. Also, there's more buttons if you want to check those out. You can also provide reactions. And at the top, if you're having trouble with some weird views in Zoom, use the top button that says view. It looks like a checkerboard up there. Use that to change your view settings, and that will get you to the right view in Zoom meeting. So today we're in session 4, forecasting the future of Kentucky's freight economy. Yesterday we had our opening sessions where we were able to get some real strong support from state leadership. We were able to see some of the federal changes that are coming with presentations from from MARAD and the Waterways Council. And the neighboring states presentations followed that, where we had some of your partners and states just across the border presenting some of their best practices. So today we'll jump into what Kentucky's future freight economy looks like. Like to go ahead and welcome our speakers. We have Paul Bingham from IHS Markit. He's the Director of Transportation Consulting. He will be giving you a presentation on economic forecast based on 2018 data and showing the future forecast out to 2045. And following Paul, we have Chandler Duncan, who's the project manager on this project from Metro Analytics. He's the senior partner at Metro Analytics, and will be providing an overview of the application of the forecasted data showing the growth strategies for Kentucky's freight networks. So with that being said, I give you just a brief overview. And Paul Bingham, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. It's great to be back with all of you virtually. I wish we could all be there in person, but that's not to be. Maybe that's for the future. And in fact, that's what the focus of this session is today, to talk about the forecasts that our company has produced for use in the project to provide an outlook for making planning decisions looking forward. So the purpose here is to present the demand forecast scenarios that we've done. So this is looking to the future for the commodity flows across the 11 public river ports in the Commonwealth. These forecasts are multimodal. We have forecasts of the truck and the rail freight, which are the primary focus for diversion potential to the waterways and for handling by the ports in Kentucky. And we anticipate that the use of these scenarios can help account for uncertainty in the freight markets. Obviously, having lived through the pandemic so far, we know that there's long-term great uncertainty at times about what the future path is going to be. There's no single point forecast that it's going to be achieved and actually correct. So we have produced a set of scenario forecasts that cover all the freight activity in the state and the surrounding hinterland counties for the port market area. So go to the next slide, Jimmy. And let's keep going. So the context for this freight forecast is that the base year data we're using, so the historic data, is the Transearch data product from IHS Markit. And in that data set, we have identified the ability to look at the freight flows for the context of each of the 11 ports. Those are the 7 Kentucky river ports that are operating now. And we've looked at the freight in the markets for the defined hinterlands for the 4 developing ports. And for each of these, the concept is to look at potential for diversion from truck and rail by forecasting by commodity, by origin, destination, region flows, all of this modal freight activity long-term. These are long-term forecasts of regional modal freight flow. These are not port-specific forecasts in the sense that we're not attempting to forecast the actual handling volumes going forwards by the ports. But we are capturing the outlook that is specific enough so that it's down at the county level. And so that the resolution of these freight flow forecasts are to be a hinterland that's reachable by the ports. And we have these growth scenarios that I'm going to go into in a little more detail in a second to try to capture the range of that. So let's go to the next slide. As we had introduced way back in Summit number 1, we have built this analysis around a defined set of port market hinterlands. These are the draw areas, which are potentially most probable in terms of where the ports can compete. We used a general about a 90-minute driving time from each river port, looking at the road network, looking at the connectivity across river by bridge, and by ferry, where that exists, for connectivity to be able to have economic activity that generates freight either as a shipping or receiving location to be served by these ports. And as you can see, this is the aggregate of all the draw areas for all 11 ports in the Commonwealth. So these are overlapping ones, as of course you can see, and extend into Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and Ohio. So this is not just a Kentucky freight market. This is looking at the economic areas, not the political boundaries of Kentucky, saying where can you attract business potentially, most probably for each of the ports. So let's go forward. Let's go forward, Jimmy. The Transearch data, as I said, is multimodal. Some of the other specifications that matter and will be reflected in what we're going to go through is that this is a total tons per year. So it's the database is annual and then forecast. And we also forecast in value. I'm not going to spend the time to go through the value of the commodities, but that's actually obviously important in terms of potentially some of the economic development potential and how it relates to the economy using other metrics in Kentucky. Oh, and let me address this question right now. Very good question. Is the 90-minute range one way or round trip? It's a one-way trip. So this is a truck can get to or from the port in about 90-minute drive time. So the round trip concept obviously affects the potential economically for a port to be considered for service by a shipper or a receiver. So that's a very good question. Thanks for that clarification. As I said, the geography for the Transearch data starts with Kentucky, but it includes the neighboring state and river adjacent Riverport market counties. But that's not obviously from a waterborne perspective sufficient. We need to look at the rest of the world in terms of potential originations or destinations. The customer potential traffic here extends geographically even to the import and export markets of the country. And those are captured in the data set. Once we're outside of the Riverport market area counties, we have the state portions of aggregations of counties that the US government defines as business economic areas within the United States. And then we have separately identified in the Transearch data record flows, the Canada and Mexico imports and exports by country. So we know what moves cross border by truck and rail or moves maritime to and from Canada and Mexico. And then the rest of international trade, the overseas trade, is flagged as imports and exports flows. So we have the commodity totals that we're not identifying in the Transearch data set, each individual overseas trade partner country from the perspective of Kentucky and making some of the decisions and understanding the context for the future opportunities. The aggregations of those flows, with Kentucky not being a border state, perhaps except if you define it for the airport mode, allows us still to capture the influence of growth in imports and exports separately from the growth in the domestic U.S. economy. So the Transearch enables a location-specific freight flow analysis that is what we've conducted to be able to look at the potentials modally for diversion for the ports in the future under these different market scenarios. So let's go ahead, Jimmy, to the next slide. As I mentioned, the freight flow volumes are in tonnage terms measured in short tons. The equipment that we have in the database actually allows us to look at estimates of unit volumes for truck and rail modes. So rather than just total tonnage, and Chandler's going to talk about this a little bit more later in this session today, the total tonnage for the inland water and air freight is just in tonnage terms. But for truck, we actually have the ability to translate that into truck loads. And for the intermodal traffic that moves by rail and truck, we have both the units that represent a trailer or container units. And then for the non-intermodal rail, we have the actual estimates of the individual rail carloads. So the units here really are tonnage and value. And then for these modes, units of equipment in truck and rail. And obviously the value is the value of the commodities shipped. It's not the transportation revenues. So it's not a shipping rate database. It's just showing the value of the commodities themselves. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So let's set up what these growth scenarios are. these forecast growth scenarios are defined very specifically to capture an economic value of growth forecast concept. These are to be demand driven, that reflect a combination in our macroeconomic forecasting models of expectations around industry production, consumer and business consumption, and trade. So we capture all the big elements that drive freight activity in the economy. So it is manufacturing production, it's mining, it's agricultural production, it is anything that actually generates a physical volume, even indirectly, such as the generation of waste and scrap is derived from industrial production and consumer and business consumption activity. These are long-term forecast scenarios. They go out to 2045. So from 2020, this is a 25-year look out into the future. This is meant to capture in the baseline, the most likely possible paths we have for the overall economy without further major disruptions or shocks. So we're not introducing, you can think of these as long-term trend forecasts in that we're not imposing a business cycle, say where we're coming, except as reflected in the historical data that we have. And these baseline forecasts, even though the base year freight flow data that's used in this in Transearch is 2018, the macroeconomic forecast scenarios have actually been generated using data that is partially updated through 2020. So actually we have captured some of the influence of the pandemic, which obviously we're still in from an economic perspective in these forecasts, but we're not forecasting any future shocks that would affect that trend line. So to try to allow for that potential, which is real, obviously, for many reasons, not just from pandemics, but for anything that can cause a business cycle disruption up or down. We have a higher growth and a lower growth alternative, and I'm going to explain it in a minute a little bit more how those are characterized. But generally what you can think of these as, and we're using as labels, optimistic performance for the economy and a pessimistic performance for the economy for these higher and lower growth alternative forecasts. And sort of the top line headline summary of, well, what is that really going to mean? It means on an average basis. So this is a compound average annual impact over the entire 25-year period of the gross domestic product, so our biggest measure of the macroeconomy, in the optimistic case, growing 0.4% higher every year. And in the pessimistic, the lower growth scenario, it averages of GDP growth of 0.6% lower per year. That doesn't sound like a whole lot in any one year, but actually on a base where the US economy in a boom year, in fact, this year, our company's forecasting economic growth of near 5%. But that's actually very unusual for the United States. Typically, the United States is doing well if it can grow near 3%. So a 0.4% or a 0.6% is still quite a substantial variance from that likely baseline. And over time, actually, that compounds. So let's go to the next slide, Jimmy, and see what that starts to look like. Now, I apologize. This is a little bit busy of a table. This is a sort of a macroeconomist view of the world with just very major economic indicators summarized here, with the first column of data being a long-term historic average looking back over the 20-year period from 1989 to 2019. And then the three columns for the three scenarios of the baseline first. So that's our sort of control or our most likely expected forecast scenario. And then the higher growth and the lower growth as optimistic and pessimistic. The top line there of data is a potential output series that gives you a general idea of the growth rate of total output. So think of manufacturing productivity. This is goods and services output. So this is as an economist measures it in value terms over time, growing slower in the future in the baseline than we've had historically in the last 20 years of 1.9%. Similarly, the GDP number, which I'd mentioned is sort of the top line, that's perhaps the best to understand. As I had mentioned, this average annual growth rate of the optimistic being this 0.4% higher, the 2.3% average, rather than the 1.9 that we're forecasting for this 25-year US growth. And then pessimistic growth of only 1.3%. You can see some of the composition of what is driving that set of top line conclusions, where consumption in the economy, which is very important. In fact, that's listed first after GDP because in value terms, that's on an average year in the last decade or so, that's represented roughly 70% of the US economy is consumption. The historic average growth in that has been faster than GDP growth at 2.7%. Our baseline forecast is that grows 2.2%, optimistically 2.5%, and pessimistic actually a full percentage point less. That's very relevant in terms of some of the commodities that we're forecasting that tend to be consumption driven in terms of the volumes that we expect in the future. And then we also have other factors that affect some of the economic development opportunity in the state, including estimates of business fixed investment. This is the capital equipment. This is plant and facility investment. This is the category in which we expect to see the Commonwealth can take advantage of businesses making decisions for their own markets and supply chains. And we have that baseline of 2.6% growth is slower than we saw in the last 20 years with the outlook for the economy. But on the optimistic side, a growth of 3.2%, which is faster than the growth in consumption. So there's still a lot of opportunity in what that represents in value terms. And then we have, for completeness, for the rest of the coverage of the components of gross domestic product includes, in addition to the consumption investment, the government category and our expectations for slower growth in government over this long-term period, not right now coming out of the stimulus tied to the recession, but longer term, expecting to see that average less. And this is the total of government. This is not just the federal government. This is the state of Kentucky. This is county. This is every municipal government in aggregate in the economy totaled up. And then we have our trade categories, imports and exports. We are forecasting at this very top line of imports and exports of goods and services. The import forecast is for, and for the trade forecast for exports, slower growth in the future long term than we've seen in the last 20 years when we've seen the effects of globalization tremendously in the US economy. That tends to be something that's going to be slower going forwards, but you can still see that the growth rates of imports and exports are faster than the growth rates of the economy as a whole. And within that, imports continue to grow faster than exports. And that implies long-term that trade, even though the differences are not huge, there is more opportunity for growth that's going to be coming from the import and export markets than from the domestic economy. And that translates right into the commodity category forecasting that we've done and is a factor in the growth rate forecast that we have in total for each of the commodities that we've done the forecast for. A couple of other indicators just to give you an idea of other characteristics of what that set of the future looks like under these scenarios includes labor force. So this is how fast and the number of workers who are looking for jobs, who are in the workforce, employed, will be in the future. And this reflects the demographics of the United States, the working age population that we're actually forecasting. And now IHS Markit is doing that forecast ourselves. We formerly used to use the Census Bureau's forecast, but we're now doing our own. And that's for slower growth. The workforce forecast reflects slow population growth in the economy, especially in the age range of those that are most likely to be working. You know, there's some growth in some of the older population, but as far as those available to be workforce growth, and this again is at a national level. This isn't at a county level or a state level. This is in aggregate for the country. The workforce growth rate is just 0.5% per year going forwards. And in the optimistic and the pessimistic, you can see we have faster workforce growth and lower for workforce growth over that long-term period. The potential for increase in our per capita income and our feelings of wealth are tied to productivity in the economy. This is total combined what the economists call factor productivity. It includes labor productivity in terms of what output versus wages, but also the productivity of capital investments and other factors of production in the economy. We're forecasting a slightly slower growth in productivity going forward in the next 25 years compared to the past, but not a tremendous difference. This is a somewhat slowdown, and it reflects a shift, I guess, in how much gain we can expect to see from additional adoption of technology in the economy, which is primarily That combined with better management methods and perhaps some other improved processes over time as to where that productivity growth comes from. But in the optimistic forecast, we actually are forecasting productivity growth actually is a little higher than we've had historically on average. And then in the slower growth scenario, actually a bit worse in terms of what we'd expect to see. So industrial production is the value of output combined from industrial activity, so it excludes sectors like government and some of the services sectors that are not classified under industrial industry categories. And the forecast growth there is important because that's all oftentimes closely correlated and aligned to the growth in freight activity. Because so much of industrial activity is tied to manufacturing or resource production or extraction, that then actually generates those freight volumes that we're looking at in this study to capture. And then just two more considerations for perspective. The inflation, we're not forecasting it gets out of hand, but there are some differences there that affects valuation when it's looked at in nominal terms of about 2% per year. The unemployment also shows an average of lower unemployment going forwards than we had in the last period in all three scenarios. And that's also somewhat a reflection of that slow growth in the labor force, but it's also a reflection of expectations that the economy is able to, coming out of the pandemic, actually longer term, get back a little bit closer to where we had higher levels of overall employment right before the pandemic, and assuming that we can achieve that on a sustained basis, which is actually sort of a good news story. But it still implies that, any unemployed worker is a loss to the economy and is tragic for that individual and their family. So it's still a concern in terms of economic development that we consider what that means going forward. So I can address this more offline if you have more questions. There's obviously a lot behind this. There's several hundred equations in the macroeconomic model that generate this, and then those get translated into several hundred industry sectors. And there's a lot of complexity that's hidden in this brief summary I've just brought you that helps explain and detail what's behind all of this. So anyway, let's move ahead, Jimmy, to the next slide. And I want to shift now specifically to the forecast for the public Riverport hinterland areas. There's some important additional qualifiers, I think, that are useful to understand about these forecasts. Under all three scenarios, we are assuming that there is a continuation and completion of waterway and port infrastructure improvements underway. So say, for example, where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has already programmed and already underway improvements to the waterway system, that those will proceed as planned. But very importantly, we are not assuming new improvements that are not yet already underway or approved. So there's a whole host of improvements to the transportation infrastructure system in the country that are not even specific just to the waterways and ports, but to the rail system, to the roadway system. And we have not assumed any specific explicit set of those improvements beyond those that are already known today. So there's not assumptions about technology transformation or so forth that would therefore affect competitiveness and the potential for modal competition or commodity competition or regional competition that all have dimensions in these forecasts. That also then implies, and there is no explicit port competitiveness changes assumed here. We are not assuming in these forecasts that the public river ports in the Commonwealth become more or less competitive from where they have been coming into this study historically. And that also then has implications for the potential diversion of the waterway transport, that it can change the future Riverport volumes that are in the baseline forecast if those opportunities are captured. So the forecasts provide the baseline upon which diversion can happen, and then reflected back through the entirety of the economic quantification of activity in the economy, the economic modeling, could reflect the change that could be affected by the waterway system behaving differently for the Commonwealth in the future, with port diversion that is captured through things such as changes in those assumptions about infrastructure improvements. If we make capital investments in a particular port and it captures business that's amongst the demand forecast that we're going to go through and talk about, the future can be different than these scenarios are showing in terms of what is captured and the economic performance for the state. And that's really a key part of this study, is to set us up to say these forecasts are going to provide us with sort of the opportunity set that exists for the state. And then coming out of the work that is done later in the study to focus in on some of those economic development opportunities and some of the information provided to identify specifically where some of those opportunities are, to have the follow through, the follow up, to have the state actually capitalize on those opportunities and capture them for Kentucky. So Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to start at the top with the big picture, if you will, of the Riverport forecast. And I'm starting with a graph here that you'll see replicated in structure as I go through each of the individual Riverports, where I have the base year 2018 in dark blue bars, and then the tonnage levels in the forecast scenarios in the three separate bars that all represent the same endpoint year of 2045 for that baseline forecast, and then the high growth and the low growth labeled here as optimistic and pessimistic for 2045. And then a comparison here modally on this graph. I have some other ones that I'm going to show you shortly for the rail, the truck, the waterborne, and then one to see you the total market on the right to give you an idea of how, what we're talking about in terms of tonnage. The volumes here are huge, and that's not surprising. I mean, we're talking about, literally billions of tons in total in 2045 that are in the total of what is moving across this large all port hinterland. This refers back to the port hinterland area in the very first map that I showed you in the slides, covering the multi-state region, most of Kentucky and then that neighboring area. There's a massive amount of freight activity in this part of the country, but that's no surprise to any of you. And then the reason that the waterborne flows here look relatively small is because they're swamped by the huge volume of daily truck and rail activity that are in that region. And we're going to focus in, for the purposes of this study, on that truck and rail categories, because that's where the potential for diversion to water is more than what we expect to see in terms of water to water diversion, which could still happen. I should also note right here, you can see that the comparison top line is that there's slightly lower levels for rail in the future than we have seen in 2018 base year. And there's a big reason for that you're all aware of, which is the long-term forecast decline in coal, which comes up again and again. And I'm going to mention that several more times today in terms of its impact on these total numbers. When we're looking at the big picture of freight activity for Kentucky, this long-term decline of coal is going to continue to affect the big picture total of what's the opportunity set for growth of freight handling in the future as demand for thermal coal especially continues to decline. It shows up in the waterborne mode in terms of what we're forecasting already in the baseline, and it shows up in rail as those are the two primary modes that have the greatest tonnage movement. It's also actually embedded in some of the shorter haul truck movements, but those are swamped by growth that we see in the rest of the economy for other commodities. Now, if you look at the column on the left, I've tried to summarize what these bar graphs show on the right in terms of the impacts of the total tonnage. This is the sum total on the percentages on the column on the left are not just for 1 year. This is the aggregate growth from, I should have labeled this a little better, I suppose, to say 2018 to 2045. So how much will the market grow in this 25-year period from where we are today in total? And that means, how much volume are we talking about in tonnage that we expect that the freight system to be able to handle in 25 years? And the growth of that is that in the optimistic scenario annually, that's almost fully a quarter more freight in total tonnage for the system than we had coming in the base year in 2018. And our baseline growth is 18% growth. So The trend, even if the Kentucky Riverports are not able to capture any additional traffic, there would still be an expectation of growth in the overall market of what's moving in total. And then broken out in terms of the target modes of forecast areas for truck and rail. We're seeing faster growth than that total for all modes in the truck. And really the growth is primarily derived from this truck activity, the baseline being 34.7% growth, and the optimistic, over 40% growth in truck tonnage in 2045 from where we are in the base year. And the pessimistic scenario being, even the slowest growth scenario here is seeing truck activity in 2045 compared to what we had in 2020 being 25%. And the rail tonnage decline is reflecting what I had mentioned earlier. Because this is the total of all commodities, this is driven by the drop in coal traffic. There is growth in rail tonnage in most other commodity categories over that long-term period, but the decline in coal from the base in 2018 actually swamps all of that. In other words, the baseline forecast and even the optimistic forecast is that the total in terms of tonnage moved by rail in 2045 is for a decline because of that decline in coal traffic. And the pessimistic scenario is actually that we see slower growth in the other commodities, and the fall off in coal is such that you actually see a 10% decline, which is not good news for the railroads, but is not a new story. And not a good news for Kentucky in terms of the economy either. I mean, this is no getting around that. This is the decline in coal really has a profound effect. And obviously in certain parts of Kentucky, it's catastrophic in terms of the economics of the coal producing regions that really have no substitute in terms of a freight tonnage perspective that could generate to match the volumes of extraction and the shipment by the freight carriers of coal volumes. So Jimmy, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to take us now through each of the Riverports, and in fact, the remainder of my presentation is going to be going through Riverport by Riverport. So let's move to the first set. I'm going to take us through the developed Riverports. So these are the ports that have current operating tonnage by commodity as well as others. And let's go to the next slide. And then I'm going to do the developing ports subsequently. And so starting with Hickman Fulton County Riverport Authority. The draw area here is the map on the left, updated from what you had seen back in Summit 1 in terms of how we depict this. You can notice the draw area extends outside of Kentucky into counties in Tennessee and even a county in Missouri that are using that same general definition of what's reachable by truck. And also I should add, rail is taken into consideration here, and specifically for the Hickman Fulton County Riverport Authority, they have this 10-Ken short line railroad that connects over to the CN rail, which is a major north-south main line that serves a very broad area beyond just this market hinterland. So the opportunities in the forecast that we see for Hickman Fulton County Riverport Authority being on the Mississippi system are mostly thought of in a north-south movement perspective, though there is a hinterland which reaches eastward into Kentucky in the southwestern part of the state. And if we look at what those are, they're primarily agricultural and manufacturing hinterlands. And this total area is about 21 counties across actually the 4 states of Kentucky, Illinois, dipping down up into Illinois and down into Tennessee and Missouri. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. And I've got for each of the ports specifically, I have 2 sets of graphs I'm going to show. So the first 2 graphs for each port includes what we see here are the modal freight forecast scenarios for rail, truck, and water in tonnage terms, with the base year for 2018 and then the forecast for each of the 3 scenario alternatives. And then also a look by direction. And this has perhaps a little less use, except that you'll see in each one of these ports, in every case, you'll see that the through tonnage, which is we define as not terminating or originating in the hinterland area for the port itself, but the traffic that is handled by the freight network in the port hinterland. So this is freight that is moving through the region that is served by the port, but doesn't originate or end there, but it can include even a mode shift. In other words, if it comes in on a truck and then goes out by barge, or comes in by truck and goes out by rail car, but it originated outside the region and is destined for somewhere else, it shows up in this through tonnage. And because by definition, these river ports are on the Ohio and the Mississippi systems, and because of Kentucky's position in the country connecting many other major markets, there is a lot of through freight activity that we see in Kentucky generally. Kentucky is a critical state, handling enormous volumes on all three modes of transport. There is, major movements by rail, by truck, and by barge that move through the state. Specifically here, the truck tonnage under our optimistic forecast scenario is up to almost 400 million tons per year in 2045, and the growth that's reflected here is still primarily coming from truck. Even in this case, we see some rail volume decline in total by 2045, and slightly higher volumes of outbound than inbound freight in terms of what's expected. And that reflects a lot of the resource commodities, especially agriculture, coming more outbound from the region than inbound. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide, which provides the final set I have for each of these individual ports is focusing it now on the top commodities. So this is a forecast for the hinterland in aggregate, so across all of the directions and across all the modes of the freight forecast tonnage, and then rank ordered. And you'll see these are roughly the top 10 with the greatest volume in the base year, the 2018 base year, in the bottom of the graph. And this pattern that we expect to see is not atypical for the Commonwealth ports, where we see the coal category today is number one, has the biggest tonnage moving in the region. But by 2045, coal has fallen substantially behind other categories that are the sources of growth and are where the opportunity lies in the future. Grain becomes number one, seeing some substantial growth, and in the optimistic scenario, quite a bit of growth. The next category is a little bit hard to define in the sense of the individual products that are handled, but it's our warehousing and distribution center traffic. And the growth rates here actually for the three scenarios are about the same. And the reason for that is the approach that we have for the forecasting for the total tonnage for these categories is derivative of some of the others. And we know the total in terms of the types of those commodities, but we didn't differentiate them so much in the optimistic and pessimistic so that they look very close together. But the growth there is captured of all, think of it as all the consumer products and intermediate goods that are not identified specifically by products. So that's, for example, is where we get to the level of, say, a grocery chain distribution center, where those goods then go out to the individual stores mixed within a truck from those final point of distribution. And primarily this warehouse and distribution center traffic is moving by truck in terms of tonnage that we've captured. There is some of it that comes in by rail to rail served facilities, but by and large, this tends to be truck traffic. And then for the port region here, the other categories, though, that we pick up are all potential movements by barge ultimately. If we look at the oil seeds, the oil kernel, nuts, and seeds category as number 3, that's where the soybeans show up, which is a tremendous potential in terms of growth going forwards. Something that I had mentioned earlier is a potential for economic activity. You don't necessarily conduct economic development activities to generate it or produce it, but waste and scrap handling is not insignificant. Things like scrap metals actually have very high value and are a significant potential opportunity in some portions of the state. And this is one of them where there is enough industrial activity in waste and scrap production that we actually are assuming in all 3 of the forecast scenarios that it becomes one of the opportunities for the region, ranked in as number 4. And then a category that perhaps is new for some folks, and you can see actually in the rank ordering of where it starts from in the base year is not even as significant as, say, sand and gravel, is the plastics and synthetic fibers. This includes the petrochemical production that is being driven for tremendous growth in the United States as an export commodity. This is the chemical companies that are taking advantage of low feedstock fuels, especially natural gas, to build plants in the United States, especially fed by some of the low-cost energy in the middle of the country, and specifically in where Kentucky is. This is some of, say, the Marcellus shale fields as an example of where some of that comes from. But the point is, some of these plants are being built newly and are anticipated to be forecast over the forecast period to be producing new goods like plastic resins that move essentially in bulk, but require, some careful handling so that they're still in the condition they're supposed to be when they get to their customers. Oftentimes for export, moving long distance. So this provides a tremendous opportunity for the state. And I'm going to mention this several more times as we go through the other ports. And Jimmy, let's keep going here. Let's go to the next slide. As we move around to the Paducah Mccracken County Riverport Authority on the Ohio and the Tennessee, this is a competitive market hinterland of 32 counties, obviously across river in Illinois, but also reaching down into Tennessee and over into Missouri. Paducah is very well, as you all know, very well established existing gateway and really a connectivity point, a port where it has potential for intermodal, but it doesn't have direct rail service today. So truck is the primary diversion potential focus for the likely economic development activities for further capture of market share in Paducah. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide and look at how some of that plays out in the forecast. Truck is forecast still to be the biggest opportunity here. The region rail is included in this for Paducah without the direct rail services. There is rail service within the hinterland area of the port by far, and that, in a 25-year period, there's even options that maybe rail can be exploited even if you don't have direct rail service right at the port. The forecast for inbound is actually going to continue to reflect that this port serves more of a regional production output handling marketplace, and that's expected under all three scenarios to be slightly lower though than we had in the future, partly reflecting declines in coal. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. If we look at the commodity mix, again here, there's the big decline of coal volumes falling from being the strong number one to number three in this region, the hinterland by 2045. And as we're going to see in a couple of other cases, again, grain becomes number one in terms of the potential volume handling in the region, as both the domestic and the foreign export markets for grain production and the agricultural production opportunities that exist in this hinterland remain strong. Again, the warehousing distribution center traffic is number two. I noted here that faces some diversion challenges. Even being truck oriented because of the requirements for transportation service, performance, quality that are inherent in a distribution warehousing operation where barge service, given the velocity of barges on the river system, makes its use less obvious. However, we've included it, and it's important we should note that the potential exists for container on barge service in the state in the future, and it could very well happen that that grows enough so that we start to see that on the Mississippi and Ohio for Kentucky in this forecast period. So not only is it important to include, it's something that we don't exclude from a discussion in economic development. But primarily, most of the other categories here, as you see with the soybeans and the oil kernel, nuts and seeds category, or the waste and scrap, or even traditional handling of the broken stone and riprap categories, the volumes are there, and that actually forecast to see growth in all of those categories going out long-term to 2045. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. If we move upriver to Eddyville, the Eddyville Riverport Industrial Development Authority market area is 32 counties that are in Western Kentucky, as we expect to see, and then up into Illinois and Tennessee. There's a lot of agriculture manufacturing activity, of course, also that overlaps with the same draw areas for the prior ports. If we look at the real core of this is going to be for opportunity agricultural production in this hinterland that we're forecasting for top growth. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. And this breaks out by mode again, with truck seeing the greatest total volume forecast in the forecast period, with the decline showing up in rail and in the waterborne volumes. Most of this is through activity, but we're forecasting the opportunity for growth here is more outbound than inbound because of the production in the region, such as we mentioned for agriculture. And let's go to the next slide. For the top commodities, the coal again here is falling away from to number 3 by 2045, and still in decline at that point, with grain again here as number 1 for the opportunities in that same warehouse and distribution center traffic showing up as number 3. The broken stone and riprap category has some more opportunity here in Eddyville based on its location to some of the producing quarries and some of the end markets. And then the soybeans come in again for the importance of agriculture, especially on the outbound direction for the region. And then waste and scrap is 6th in this list. You'll see some others include the miscellaneous industrial organic chemicals are forecast to see substantial growth. That's related to the same petrochemical industry production that we talked about before. There's also the miscellaneous coal petroleum products. That really is petroleum products in terms of what's the volume opportunity there. And they're actually forecast to see a slight decline, but still make this set of the top categories in this commodity set by 2045. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. In Henderson County Riverport Authority draw area, as we move upriver, the 30 counties here extend up into Illinois and start to reach into Indiana, obviously across river. Again, this is agricultural and manufacturing in the region that provide the opportunities, building on some of the traffic that the Henderson County Riverport handles already. Let's go to the next slide, Jimmy. The growth here again is still mostly the through traffic on the Ohio and on the rail network and on the truck net, the roadway network in the region. Forecast is for decline in volume overall, also affected by coal, but still with more opportunity for outbound freight under the 3 scenarios than we see for the inbound traffic. But both here still are, these volumes, even for what we're talking about here, this is still, 50 million tons a year. There's an awful lot of freight, even at this measure, moving through the region, but still primarily truck, with that decline for rail shown in the region. And let's move to our commodity graph slide next, Jimmy. The drop in coal here actually falls to number 2 rather than number 3 that we've seen for some of the other ports, with a tremendous drop off in percentage terms. And grain also here is number 1 in the region, with soybeans coming in at number 3. So the total of those 2, actually, if we put together the oil seeds and nuts growth is still substantial for 2045 for the region. But I should note here, in addition to that, this mixed consumer products and warehouses that shows up as number 4. For Henderson, we also have iron and steel that starts to show up as more significant, reflecting some of these specialized steel plants and metal manufacturing activity in the region. And that's true in some of the other ports I'm going to talk about shortly, that there's some other opportunities here. And then also in the industrial chemicals, we also see petroleum refining showing up here. There are some other commodities that move in bulk and tend to move very efficiently and in shipment sizes for which inland water transport can be very competitive. So this helps us to see where some of the opportunities for the economic development of the capture, the diversion activity to actually occur in some of the other diversified commodities handling in the future. Let's go to the next slide. for the Owensboro Riverport Authority, the hinterland here is just 21 counties in Kentucky and then cross river into Indiana. There's a lot of product manufacturing here as well as the agriculture in the region. This picks up the aluminum that's already handled in Owensboro. And like we anticipate seeing in the future, a continued strengthened growth in that particular industry category. Let's go to the next slide, Jimmy. The outbound growth here is substantially greater than the inbound in total in what's forecast, though it's still a bit with that coal decline, effect, still showing its impact in the 2045 timeframe. If we look at it, the opportunities here, there's a little bit closer balance between rail and truck in this hinterland than we've seen on the ports further downriver and to the west, which means that there is potentially some more diversion opportunity that may come from rail, accepting, of course, the focus on the coal, which is affecting the decline here. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide and look at the commodities. In this case, we actually have in the region, because of the auto manufacturing plant location, when we look across all the modes of transport, it's actually motor vehicles that are number one. And we're actually forecasting some growth in that long term, that this industry that is strong in Kentucky doesn't go away. And actually there is some forecast growth under all three scenarios in Kentucky, not dramatically, but that shows up both in the finished motor vehicles category and in the parts and accessories. So the tier suppliers that supply the assembly plants and the finished motor vehicles. Now, we don't have in our expectations that you're going to have a lot of finished motor vehicles moving by barge, but in some volume in the very long term, that's even plausible. What's much more likely that we expect to see in the auto parts category, where there may be some opportunities there for efficient, reliable movements of some categories of those manufactured goods if we end up with some container on barge movements serving the state ports. The iron and steel is related to that, but not exclusively tied to the auto industry. We also have a freight of all kinds category showing up here, which is the traffic that, as you can think of as sort of the secondary traffic typically handled by trucks. This isn't just say grocery store deliveries, things like less than truckload deliveries of a combined set of products from multiple shippers going to multiple destinations. And then also the warehousing and distribution center traffic that we've seen in other regions. But again, here showing up is the plastic matter synthetic fibers category. This is that petrochemical business growing with the miscellaneous plastic products also right behind that. And we even show here, in addition to the aluminum and the smelting categories, the pharmaceutical sector, which we're forecasting for strong growth in the region, captured by some of the plants that exist within this hinterland region. It's not likely that we're going to see a lot of finished drug products coming out of pharmaceutical manufacturing, but some of the chemical precursors that go into those are not necessarily excluded from potential movement on the inland waterways if there's sufficient volumes that are demanded, which obviously is a shipment size issue. But if we get to the container on barge world in the future, that starts to come into that economic development set that's relevant to the state. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. In Louisville, we have a bit of a different look in terms of some of the dimensions of the history data of freight activity. The diversion potential here for commodity categories is a little bit different mix of the agriculture, resource, and manufactured goods across the 37 counties that are really just across river in Indiana, plus in Kentucky. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. The volumes here, I didn't include a mode category that exists in the data, but shows up almost invisibly in this chart of the tonnage, which is air cargo. The Worldport UPS hub facility that's in this hinterland for Louisville is a potential factor in terms of economic development. In terms of potential for mode diversion directly, it's not really a factor. You're not going to get a barge load diverted out of that, but there is supply chain investment activity tied to what's visible here in the truck and rail categories that's tied to having that Worldport facility anchor for economic development for freight activity in the region, where companies engage in different modes and different commodity movements, especially on the throughput side, which are very high volumes. And we're actually forecasting growth for the region for both the inbound and the outbound, partly as a consequence of that by 2045. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide and look at the commodity mix that we see here with Coal is actually less important for Louisville already in the base year, where it's actually second to the handling of the broken stone and riprap category. That's, all those goods used in road building and construction and so forth. But obviously the forecast is that coal goes away, and the strength stays because of a continuation of demand for those sorts of materials within the region, and even externally. That category actually is expected to go into the future as number one for the region. And you can see number two behind that is the consumer products and warehouses. That reflects the nature of some of the distribution center activity in the region. But having said that, there's a lot of economic activity already in the base year, and forecasts going forwards to manufactured goods that are very amenable to inland waterway transport, including petroleum products as number three, that already move in fairly substantial proportions, but we're forecasting for the strongest growth over this period. And then grain is number four, iron and steel coming in at number five. And then in this region, even still because of the auto manufacturing overlap, that there's even motor vehicles here. There is also the waste and scrap shows up, and the industrial organic chemicals also showing opportunity for growth as we forecast by 2045, substantial tonnage increases for those commodity categories. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. If we move upriver to Greenup-Boyd County, Riverport Authority, the coal volume is affecting this region like all the others, but there is growth opportunity in manufactured and resource commodity categories. The hinterland here extends to the 25 counties in Kentucky, Ohio, and over eastward into West Virginia. There's some different little mix then of some of the commodity opportunities for this eastern port that we haven't seen in some of the previous ports further downriver to the west. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. This is very much a truck dominated market in terms of opportunity. We are forecasting that decline still for rail in the aggregate, but there are opportunities even here for some rail diversion, still with more outbound than inbound under all three scenarios. But it's still a world where the total volumes are increasing and the through activity are such that there is potential here for this port to capture more activity. And let's go to the next slide, Jimmy. On the commodity side, besides the decline in the coal volume falling down to number two by 2045. So it's still, the lingering amount of coal that's still moving. For example, there's some met coal and there's still going to be some lingering thermal coal demand, but volume still greatly diminished from the base year. The opportunities being in that mixed consumer products and warehousing in terms of total commodity activity in the region. But the commodities more amenable, obviously, to the waterborne traffic, include some of the broken stone, industrial chemicals. The waste and scrap is significant in this region, but not ignoring agriculture. Field crops is number six here in the region in terms of what's captured. And even in this case, we pick up, the niche business in Kentucky, but not insignificant, and forecast for substantial percentage growth off the base year of the distilled and blended liquors category. I don't know how much of that's going to move by barge, but in a container on barge world, there's some possibilities that might happen, say, on the export side in the long term by 2045. So let's move ahead. We're now going to go through each of the four developing public river ports, and let's start, Jimmy, with go to the next slide, please. The West Kentucky Regional Riverport Authority, the hinterland is defined by how the port exists right now, at least in terms of what's anticipated to operate, would be 27 counties in Kentucky, Illinois, and Missouri. There is potential here from rail and truck commodity growth that comes from agriculture, the manufacturing categories, and some of the other resource commodities. Let's go to the next slide. Competing for some of the other freight flows in the region here, perhaps with some neighboring state ports, which we heard about a little bit yesterday. There's substantial tonnage moving on the Mississippi here, especially on the throughput side. But even if we look at the terminating inbound and outbound, it's non-trivial, and we're actually forecasting growth in the outbound tonnage by 2045. Most of that shows up over in truck, but even the rail volumes here don't decline like we expect to see as much, where you have a greater proportion of rail traffic tied to coal. So there's even some opportunities for rail activity in the region that we're forecasting going forward. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide and look at some of the commodity mix for the freight flows in the region. You see the decline in coal. You know, it gets displaced by grain as number one. And falls substantially by 2045. But we do see that growth of grain off of the base year. In all three scenarios, there'll be an increase in grain volumes moving. The warehousing and distribution center traffic we're forecasting to be number two. It's already substantial. And number three within the region. Then the soybeans and the oil kernel, nuts and seeds category. The waste and scrap seeing actually a pretty substantial percentage increase under all three scenarios. In the region, and then the broken stone and sand and gravel categories. But the plastics and resins show up here too. There is some real opportunity in that strongly forecast growth for the plastic matter and synthetic fibers category. There's still also here a forecast of very moderate growth, but still substantial volumes of those petroleum products that show up in the petroleum products category. Jimmy, let's go ahead to the next slide. Moving over to Meade County Riverport Authority, the hinterland here is 29 counties in Kentucky and then across the river in Indiana. The potential here, I should make note of, is iron and steel growth with that Nucor plant. You know, we've got that grant award and the economic development activity already tied to this steel production activity. As I'd mentioned before, that's one of the categories of manufacturing in the regions here that provides opportunity in the future, but not exclusively. There's also growth coming forwards for, and let me, yeah, Mike, I spotted your comment here. Very importantly, for the developing ports in the Commonwealth, we don't have a actual port volume activity handled by a port that is looking for business, that's defined a market. We instead are looking at the geography defined by this hinterland map. So for each of these developing ports, this is the total of freight activity moving in the region. So this is regional freight activity originating, terminating. So it's derived from activity in the region, or it's freight commodities that are being consumed and purchased for use within the region, and the through traffic. So on the river, the through traffic, or the through traffic on the interstate system or on the rail network. So we look at the tonnage for the developing ports. You can think of it as it's 100% diversion in the sense that these ports are not handling freight volumes today, but the potential comes from diversion from the existing activity and the future forecast activity, especially for each of the hinterland areas for each of the developing ports in Kentucky. With that, let's move to the next slide. If we look at, for example, here, the total of the through traffic, you know, you've got 700 million tons in the optimistic case and through traffic for this region, and forecast of growth in both inbound and outbound tonnage over the forecast period, which provides opportunities to compete for traffic that isn't even there today, but that would be in the future. So one of the economic development challenges for developing ports is being able to understand that the opportunities may not having to be competing freight away from somebody else who's already handling it, but to capture new freight that isn't being handled by anybody today because it's in the future. It's a volume that is going to be produced tomorrow or in the future here in the long term by 2045 that's not currently being handled by anybody because it's going to be a volume that exceeds the volumes that have been handled in the base year. And you can see the growth here in this region for both rail and truck provides opportunities for economic development to capture some of that future freight volume. And Jimmy, let's go to the next slide and look at some of those commodities. Here we have the broken stone and riprap category actually forecast to decline a little, but still be number one in the region in terms of total volumes moved. The coal that's already number two continues to fall, almost falls off this rank order listing in terms of volumes, but is still there at number 9. That mixed consumer products, the warehousing traffic is actually forecast to grow. In this region, we also expect to see quite substantial percentage growth in the petroleum refining products, so that it comes in now as number 3 under all 3 scenarios by 2045. That's a liquid bulk handling move, obviously requires some, different, perhaps a specialized investment to be able to capture that activity. But exists in the region and provides opportunity going forwards, even in a world where we see a move away long-term from, say, some carbon fuel use. There's still going to be, in this kind of a time frame out to 2045, a lot of equipment that consumes petroleum products in the region that's still going to be demanding that. So there actually is still growth opportunity in the region for that, also where that activity occurs. And then here we also still see the opportunities for the motor vehicles industry activity and the iron and steel products that are relevant to this part of the state. And for some of those, the associated waste and scrap handling. But even here, we even have miscellaneous field crops and grain showing up substantially. There is agricultural production that is going to actually increase in the future. There's still opportunities to pursue that growth in the region as we go forward. Jimmy, let's go to our next slide. If we move further upriver, the hinterland area for the Maysville-Mason County Riverport Authority is 32 counties in Kentucky and then across river in Ohio. The potential here comes from this sort of northern Kentucky, southern Ohio, West Virginia economic activity. So we're looking at a little bit different mix of some of the industry composition in this market hinterland. Go to the next slide. The total activity on the throughput side is still quite substantial. If we look at this, over 800 million tons under all 3 forecast scenarios in the future, with a slightly higher inbound volumes than outbound for this set of regions, reflecting some of the not only the consumption by consumers and businesses in the region, but that business demand for industrial income commodities and components still dominated by truck, with a decline in total for rail and the baseline for water that's moving through the region. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. We do have the decline forecast for bituminous coal falling from number 2 to number 9, but already handled in this region is the broken stone and riprap volumes are substantial. We're forecasting in the scenarios a little bit different there. There's a decline forecast in those for the baseline, and the pessimistic scenario, a little bit of growth in that stone handling in the optimistic scenario. And so this is an example of where the different scenarios bracket whether there's really growth opportunity or not for particular commodity categories. I thought I'd bring that to your attention. Grain and agriculture here is substantial. Our forecast is that in 2045, under all 3 scenarios, the grain category is number 3 behind the mixed consumer warehousing and distribution center traffic. The iron and steel is number 4. And in this category, as we move further east in the state, industrial chemicals becomes pretty important in terms of an opportunity. And you can see that there's pretty substantial percentage terms growth in that category. And then still showing up here, as we've seen elsewhere, the opportunities for waste and scrap handling are not insubstantial. And we're forecasting actually those volumes to grow long term by 2045. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. And then if we look at the Northern Kentucky Riverport, this is, aspirational port in this market area that serves Ohio and Indiana cross river as well as Kentucky. It exists cross river inside the middle of the Cincinnati metropolitan area. There's a lot of development potential here because you're in a large metro area. Obviously, there's some competing port activity right across the river, but with the available land, and let's go to the next slide, forecasts of growth in the region, there's opportunity for this port to potentially be developed and actually capture some diversion traffic in the future. Growth in truck volume is quite substantial under all the scenarios. We actually are forecasting in this region growth in total rail activity under all 3 scenarios, driven a little bit more by inbound, by outbound, even though they're fairly balanced. There's an awful lot of through activity here on the interstate network and on the rail network. Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. We have, if we look at the commodity volumes again here, the broken stone and riprap category in tonnage terms is the greatest. And again, we have this split on the forecast within the higher growth optimistic scenario growing a little bit faster, actually seeing a little bit of a decline in that category in the baseline, and in the slower growth pessimistic scenario. That mixed consumer products and warehouses in terms of tonnage and total activity, again, is number 2. But if we look at some of those other commodity categories, the iron and steel products is going to come in with that forecast growth at number 3 by 2045, which is providing opportunity under all 3 scenarios for handling of those commodities that would not be handled today by Kentucky at all. Potentially capturing some of that hinterland activity across the river. Agricultural production in the region is already substantial. Grain in the forecast is going to show up at number 4 under all 3 scenarios. There's some real opportunity for growth in total grain activity. And in addition to the waste and scrap, there's industrial chemical activity in this region that serves other manufacturing, as well as feeding such things as that synthetic plastics and resins that I mentioned, that doesn't quite make the top list here, but is related to that industrial organic chemicals category, and then still picking up some of the motor vehicle auto industry activity in the region. So Jimmy, let's go to the next slide. With the time we've gotten through here, I think we've still got some time for questions. I know there's a whole bunch in the chat box that I've not been addressing very systematically. So Jimmy, I wonder if you'd help take me through those if you want to. I don't know if you've been reading those as we've been going along.
Yes, Paul, thank you. And yeah, we were kind of doing some chatting in the background just to coordinate this, but we'd like to go ahead, since there was so many questions, go ahead and address those now prior to Chandler's presentation. Before I get into the questions, just a reminder to everyone, this is being recorded and will be posted on the project website with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. So you'll have an opportunity to go back through what Paul presented, and also there'll be a tech memo addressing all of this that will be published and incorporated into the final document. So but we will address the questions that are here in the chat box, and then we'll move on to Chandler's presentation. So first of all, Paul, and you kind of answered the first question right off the bat, which was kind of related to the 90-minute range and it being a one-way trip. So that one was already addressed. I don't think we need to hit that again. There was a question. Do you think that the CP Railroad's purchase of the KCS will have an adverse impact on Western Kentucky tonnage forecasts?
Yeah, great question. I actually thought of this on Sunday when I learned the news. Yeah, understand what this does in terms of that network change. The Canadian Pacific is this huge Canadian railroad that runs east-west all the way across Canada, and then has some lines that they control today that reach down in the United States, primarily across, say, Minneapolis into Chicago, and then down as far as Kansas City. And from a north-south perspective, that's where the connection point is. They meet the Kansas City Southern Railroad sort of at its northern terminus at Kansas City with an interchange yard. And the combined network is really going to be almost, you think of it as serving a triangular market areas where the Kansas City Southern owns one of the major freight railroads in Mexico, and they own the biggest volume rail bridge across from Mexico into Texas, and then connect up north, through along the Gulf Coast and up through, Shreveport, and then on up to Kansas City. This provides connectivity between the Canadian rail network and the Mexican rail network, with the US in between. The extent of the rail network in the United States is actually perhaps a little bit more limited, because the Kansas City Southern, which is the majority of that, and the CP Railroad, which exists with what they took over the old Wisconsin Central network, extends through the upper Midwest, is not as strong in terms of affecting the markets that today are served through Kentucky, with one exception that I'm going to get to in a minute, by the Eastern Western Railroad. So the Norfolk Southern, the CSX, the Union Pacific, and the BNSF, that are the big 4 railroads in the United States and handle the 4 biggest volumes of rail traffic. And we see even some of the short line connectivity in Kentucky is tied to the CSX and the Norfolk Southern more than anything else. The one area where I thought that there could be some potential shift in freight activity in the region is on the western part of the state, where today the Canadian National has that old Illinois Central main line that runs up and down along the Mississippi, that has connectivity into some of the short lines in Western Kentucky, that could potentially face more competition from this combined KCS CP network in terms of that north-south flow. But as far as diversion potential to the waterways, I don't know that it's going to make a whole lot of difference. The other markets that the proponents of this merger deal, if it achieves regulatory approval, have already talked about, are such routes as Detroit to Chicago intermodal service. Which today is on 2 railroads, if you use those 2 combined networks, that potentially could provide competition, say, to the Union Pacific or the BNSF in serving those markets today. Probably not so much the traffic that's flowing through the port hinterland area that we see here. There's also some potential that we could see for some increased commodity activity between Canada and Mexico under the U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement that was took into effect last July, and in fact was named by those 2 railroads in their merger announcement as one of the opportunities they're trying to capitalize on. There's not a lot of Mexico-Canada through freight through Kentucky today. But there, you could point to some potential competitiveness issues. And the one industry sector I would point to would be the auto industry. Because of some of the requirements under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement for higher, what's so-called domestic content of autos manufactured in any of the 3 countries to be able to be sold in any of the 3 countries, there may be some nearshoring where some auto manufacturing activity in the future is more likely to be within the 3 countries than overseas, say in Asia or even in Europe. That could affect Kentucky one of 2 ways. It could say, well, Kentucky's got an established auto manufacturing industry. There's suppliers already here. That could lead to some increase in production in Kentucky, but it also could be a threat to Kentucky, because it could be that if you have greater investment in new plant and activity, say in Mexico, to serve the U.S. and Canadian market, that might be could compete with some of that auto industry activity in Kentucky long term. I don't think we know fully yet how that's going to play out, and some of it's going to depend on the ability of this network to serve the end markets that they're trying to serve with the different business lines of the rail business. Intermodal is obviously one, but they have a lot of carload traffic moving various types of merchandise, commodities. Another category that people have already talked about is the improved ability of this combined network to have Canadian crude oil coming out of the Prairie province of Alberta reach the Gulf Coast refineries. If you remember back in January when the Biden administration took office, President Biden stopped the development of the Keystone XL pipeline, which had been very controversial for environmental reasons. But if completed, would have served to export more Canadian crude oil into the U.S. market to serve some of those Gulf Coast refineries that are built to take the heavy crudes that come out of those Canadian oil fields. With that pipeline capacity not coming online and the Canadians still wanting to export and sell that crude oil, it could be that some of that moves to crude by rail, it's called, which is actually movements of large trains of crude oil that really wouldn't affect Kentucky's markets at all, but would be part of the reason for this deal to go through and actually take advantage of a combined North-South Canadian Pacific KCS network in the future. So I think I've talked enough about that. I'd happy to explore it offline with others if you want to talk about it more. But I think really the bottom line story is here. I don't think it's going to have a big negative impact at all on Kentucky as a whole in terms of how this merger plays out. And the details have to still be negotiated because the Surface Transportation Board in Washington, D.C. has to approve this deal. And sometimes to approve rail mergers, they force concessions by the railroads in terms of customers they would serve or track they would operate. I don't anticipate a radical change forced on those 2 railroads, but we still need to pay attention to the details. And we'll be talking to you about this when we get out to the individual port visits and before the project is complete. So we'll address this more fully in that context.
Following up on a rail question, it was asked the main reasons that the forecast is anticipating a major rail decline. Is that due to the decline in coal, or is
Yes.
there other reasons as well?
No, that's it. I mean, if we look at the rail, the rank ordered commodities, the decline in tonnage in the Kentucky rail and all the rail in the hinterland area. So even for, surrounding states, there's some other coal, even, mine in places like Illinois. That decline is profound and actually is so big. I mean, understand that the U.S. rail business, and for all the big railroads, the CSX and Norfolk Southern, and obviously some of the short lines in Kentucky, have been serving those coal markets. It's been the #1 commodity business for the railroads for decades, not just in Kentucky, but nationally. In terms of total revenues, total tonnage, and that decline is not over and is in the forecast. It's already to some point declined tremendously from where it was at its peak, say 15 or within the past 20 years. But unfortunately for the coal producers and for the port facilities that handle coal and the railroads that handle coal, that is a declining market, and there's under no scenario do we see there's going to be a rebound in the coal volume demand in this forecast period.
The next question is, does the truck tonnage include local drayage, including last mile drayage from the rail and water?
That's an excellent clarification question. We capture the truck tonnage that includes some of the drayage from the ports and from the rail. But understand in Transearch, there's some level of truck activity that we consider secondary that we don't capture with the same specificity of commodity and route that we do sort of the primary movements. So an example of that is some of the local parcel pickup and delivery that is truck activity, and we've been facing this in talking to Scott Thompson and the cabinet about marrying to some of the truck counts observed on the network. But thinking of sort of the primary commodity movements, most all of what you would consider the last mile drayage connectivity for intermodal moves to rail and truck are included. And
okay.
Let me add one more point to that, is that also means in terms of diversion tonnage, we would see in the future, let's say, for example, we have Kentucky Riverports capturing some of what in the baseline forecast is forecast to be truck tonnage. There would still be some residual potential truck tonnage captured that would not all go to water in terms of what would be observed activity, because you'd still need the truck to, say, connect to the Riverports.
Right. And I have another question further on down that asks, has cleaner energy been considered in these forecasts for Kentucky? Are there impacts for Kentucky's ports, such as by commodities used to create electricity, with the foreseen shift to more zero emission type vehicles?
Yes, actually, that's a very good question and a very good point. We have incorporated into the baseline and the alternative forecasts our own energy group. We have a group of energy economists who focus purely on energy markets, but energy markets of all kinds. And thinking back just even to the discussion around coal, that's primarily what we're seeing. A result of that is the shift within the energy consumption markets away from coal-fired electric generation towards other fuels. But it goes beyond that. The forecast also takes into account natural gas production and alternative fuel in terms of alternative power for things like solar and wind, the adoption of electric vehicle use in the vehicle fleets. That is all incorporated to some degree in the baseline forecast, based on our company's assessment of those trends that are already underway and that we can anticipate logically, both for regulatory reasons and for economic reasons, to proceed. So the forecast that we have for petroleum products, that we have for coal, for all of the energy commodities that are in the data set, reflect a baseline assumption about progress in the future towards adoption of alternatively fueled transportation and the fixed site generation of electric power over time in this 25-year period. So there's a baseline assumption around that. which is in the baseline forecast, and even a slightly more aggressive growth of investment and adoption of that more quickly in the optimistic forecast scenario. And in the pessimistic scenario, that's part of what's contributing to it, is slightly slower investment and adoption of those alternative technologies in the future, which are captured in the forecast. Having said that, there are still opportunities beyond what we have in our economic forecast for diversion related to that. And we can imagine that in the future for such things as ethanol production or biofuels that are included in some of these categories that are considered alternative fuels that would be viewed more environmentally friendly than the traditional fuels that are being used either for transport or for power generation.
So Paul, I just want to ask two more questions so we have time for Chandler's presentation. There's many, many more that I hope you'll be able to answer. And some of them we can answer in our next round of visits with the ports. But real quickly on these last two questions, for any given top commodity listed, are you able to drill down as to the companies that represent for each commodity category? Are you able to drill down to a deeper commodity within that larger commodity and the companies even that represent those commodities?
Yes, great question. And that's a very important point. So delivered as part of the project is a freight finder database of individual business establishments that have specific locations in these markets. And there's a full data set of those with the company names. They're tagged by industry category. That is part of what we call the freight finder data set. So for economic development use in this project, that database is available, and we can tie those back to these commodity categories. So the answer affirmatively is yes, that was thought of and it's available and intended to be used in this project.
Okay. Well, Paul, I'm going to go ahead and just bring Chandler in so he can represent his findings as well. And you'll just give me a minute. I'm going to transition again as I'm transitioning slides here. Let's remember that these questions will be answered and also can be subsequently answered when we go
we'll
to
follow up.
our port visit. So
that
being said, let me get to. I'm just trying to find it here, so I apologize for a second, everyone. All right, you do. All right, is everybody seeing the right slides there, Chandler? Does that look?
It looks right to me.
Okay.
So for those who are watching, I want to make sure everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, and I was actually staying in a hotel before this presentation, and I was told that I had to leave, and so I am I'm actually presenting from my car. So I apologize for that. I don't have the right background. But can y'all still hear me? Okay, I just want to make sure that my audio works well. So what we're going to be looking at right now is mainly just looking at how the economic change that Paul has talked about, how that kind of fits into the way that our transportation system fits together. And this is kind of just a first look that we have of how these markets can be supported by the ground transportation system in Kentucky. So we're going to be looking at the different regions of Kentucky as to where this change in market demand is expected to be occurring, and corridors that are likely to be serving those markets. And then also one of the things, and then also sort of how that's changing over time. Now, one of the things we need to make clear is, I think this slide, we are not looking at trucks and we are not looking at truckloads. We do not have that information at this point. And the reason why we don't have that information is mainly because there is a certain amount of complexity in how truckloads are defined. When you go from IHS data, which forecasts the world in tons, putting them onto truckloads and then validating that to actual base year traffic truck counts, that's a process that's still ongoing. So what we're really looking at is not truckload. What we're actually looking at is we're looking at the tonnage demand that Paul has talked about, and looking at it in relation to the type of facilities and connections that are being made and what they're supporting. So we're going to go ahead and just take a quick look at what some of these things look like when we put them on Kentucky's transportation system. Next slide. So the first thing we're going to look at is just at the national scale. When we talk about water divertible commodities, what we're really talking about is of all of the freight demand that Paul has talked about, and some of it that he didn't talk about, there's only a certain percentage of all the things that are moving on truck in particular, but also on truck and rail, that are typically things that might be carried by water. That doesn't mean that it's something that the water can capture it for that length of the move. It doesn't mean that it ever will get to water, but it means that it is a potential market for some type of waterborne traffic based on what commodity it is. The trafficking is in commodities that are movable by water. I didn't know, Paul, if you wanted to add anything more about what we mean by water divertible in terms of a definition, that we're not talking about capturable necessarily, but we're talking about commodities that can go.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's some variation in what we capture in terms of divertibility to water. It has requirements that fit what makes sense on the water. So an origin destination, obviously, that's somewhat accessible by the inland waterway network. That's predicated even when a combination with an intermodal move, and also the types of commodity shipment volumes, barring, of course, the potential for container on barge operations. Most of the other requirements then would be, the typical shipment size is being big enough to justify use of waterborne transport.
Yeah, right. So now we're going to basically just have a quick look at a little bit of mapping of these economic changes that we've been talking about. The first thing is among those commodities that are the kinds of things that can go on water, that are currently moving on truck. We're talking first of all about, well, where is all that stuff coming from? And this map basically just shows, with stars representing the Kentucky Riverport, it's showing you essentially where in the country those movements are moving to and from according to the IHS data. And what you're seeing is, and we'll provide in your individual port profiles an opportunity to zoom in there a little bit further. But what you see essentially is that Kentucky is really trading with points really throughout the United States, but really throughout the region, and that there are water divertible commodities moving by truck really on almost all of the major truck routes in Kentucky. And again, this is something that you can kind of pour into a little bit more during the port visits and look port by port at who you're trading with, as Paul had not looked at as much at trading partners as he did commodities. But this just kind of provides a nice kind of national context for this the market. Again, here we're looking at what's on the trucks that may at some point touch the waterway system or could. Next slide. In the next slide, we look at where the growth is in trucks that are carrying those potentially waterborne commodities. And what we see is significant increases of more than 50% in some of the things coming from points south and west. And that, again, has a lot to do with the nature of the commodities that Paul was talking about, particularly grain and some of those. It's interesting that you have potentially waterborne commodities moving on truck from New Orleans area. Of course, those are probably barge to truck, or water to truck intermodal traffic to begin with. And so you see significant growth in truck traffic carrying things that have some relation or could have some relation to the waterway transportation market. Next slide. And then we can go and look at the regional scale. We can come in and look a little bit more at what's happening in the Kentucky transportation system. So in this case, we're actually assigning some of those tonnages. And again, we're not really assigning them. We're not taking into account things like congestion and routing. We're just looking at what facilities and what areas of Kentucky represent where this growth is happening geographically. So in the next slide, one of the things that you see is the water divertible shipment sizes. And when we say shipment size, what we're really talking about is market size. And it isn't really the size of a shipment. It is the size of what counties in and around Kentucky are seeing the greatest growth in the movement of commodities that could find their way to the waterway system. And you see naturally that the biggest markets tend to have the biggest growth. But you see significant growth, and this is all a mapping of those movements that are exchanged with Kentucky counties that have river ports. So you see that you're trading a lot with points not only in Kentucky, Lexington, Louisville, places like that, but also even neighboring states that have waterway access, like Cincinnati, Indianapolis, St. Louis, Nashville, are exchanging growing amounts of freight with the Kentucky Riverport counties by truck. So you can see that there are a number of different places where this trade can be occurring. And much of this trade is actually coming from out of state, and it's being exchanged by truck with points out of state. And again, we can drill into exactly what those moves are as we get into our port visits following the summit. The next slide. The next slide, we're just kind of looking out, and we're looking at, okay, in terms of, again, the term shipment size is a little bit misleading. We probably need to say divertible commodity market is what we're really talking about. But we, again, very much as Paul had talked about, we see certain regions in Kentucky that are really increasing very significantly in the amount of freight that they are trafficking to and from the Riverport counties, as well as counties out in Tennessee and Indiana. And what we see is that the growth in the potentially divertible freight market or freight market of things that can move by water is not limited to Riverport counties. It's really coming from quite a bit far away. Obviously, a county with a smaller economy, it's easier to achieve a larger percentage. So you see a number of kind of rural and outlying counties, but you also see a number of fairly significant urban areas like Indianapolis, Lexington, Cincinnati, that are going to be growing in terms of what they are trucking back and forth to Kentucky's Riverport counties. And so this shows that there's really quite a wide distribution of commodities that can be carried by water that are trafficked with the Kentucky Riverport areas. Next slide. And here again, you see so again, you look at, this is just an overlay of one map on the other. And you're seeing that even as basically it's just another way of looking at it, but it is showing you that the market, the size of the overall markets, sometimes the growth is not necessarily in the places that have the biggest markets. A place that might have a relatively small market today can still be a place of considerable growth. And again, what we anticipate doing in our upcoming Riverport visits is to actually sit down with key staff from each of the Riverports, their economic development folks, and look at what these kind of analyses look like for each Riverport, and who do you want to be trading with, and what can you capture and where. Next slide. And next slide. Okay. And so then you can see also that there is some change when you look at, this is just taking a similar view where you look out beyond Kentucky. Obviously, the further away you get, the larger the analysis areas get. You're going from counties out to BEAs and larger areas of geography. But you see that even places as far away as Minneapolis, you can see Minneapolis and Chicago, Cleveland, further away places, you're going to be seeing growth in trading partners domestically that are trafficking commodities in and out of Kentucky and the Riverport counties. Next slide. So we look for just a minute at corridors in Kentucky. How is Kentucky's transportation system supporting the growth that Paul had talked about in the previous analysis? And here again, we're not really looking at trucks, but we are interested in seeing as a beginning to look at how is the rest of Kentucky's transportation system supporting this growth. And as we get into the summer, we're going to be looking more at capacity of these corridors, and does what we find in the Riverport study relate to potential growth in capacity. And this will complement some of the infrastructure discussion that will be happening in another session. But we'll just take a quick look at some of the corridors. And these corridors are basically showing places that are connecting points that are trading in commodities that have the potential to get on the water at some point. Next slide. Next slide. So right now we can just look at 2018, and what you see is in 2018, these are basically just highway corridors that are connecting points that are trafficking in those commodities that can get on the water. And there are waterway paths actually available for the trip. Again, there are a lot of reasons that things might be on the truck just because it's a commodity that could move by water. It's not always going to be competitive. It doesn't mean that you can necessarily capture it, but it does kind of show you when you take a broad look out at the larger region surrounding Kentucky, where are there things on trucks that in other cases might sometimes be on water. And you see that, of course, this is connecting all of your major trade centers, and that there's quite a bit of that. It's kind of surprising the amount of the commodity, of the tonnage, the percentage of the tonnage that is on trucks. A lot of it is in commodities that can and sometimes do go on water. And of course, part of the reason is because water has a lot of bulk commodities. Those commodities that can move by water tend to take up a lot of tons. If we look at value, we might see a different sort of an equation. So the next slide is helping us to look a little bit at where is the growth in that. And essentially, what we see is that the growth is fairly balanced among trade centers. You see some particular growth in demand up into Ohio and down into Tennessee. But essentially what you see is that there are some very specific localized pockets where you're going to see a lot of growth in that. But you're not necessarily going to see just a tremendous growth, more than 50% growth of potentially waterborne commodities trading above and beyond what is there now on the trucks. Even though, again, the existing markets that are on the trucks can in some cases represent potential diversion opportunities as we drill into where they're from and who they're trading with. Next slide. And then we can look a little bit more, and again, this is not analysis of truckload, this is an analysis of tonnage actually, and divertible tonnage that is connected by certain corridors. So let's just take a quick look at that as we get within Kentucky. The symbology on this map is a little bit interesting. It looks a little bit spring-like as we get into the spring. But what we find is that essentially, if you look today, just sort of at the connections that are being made by corridors on the Kentucky Transportation Highway Network, the thickness of the corridor represents the overall tonnage that is moving, that is exchanging traffic with Kentucky's Riverport communities. It is not surprising that you see obviously your interstates carrying the highest tonnage, and you see other significant corridors also carrying tonnage. What is also interesting is the pink within the blue is showing that share of that tonnage, which is what we would call, again, those commodities that are known at times to move by water. And so what's interesting is that the majority of the tonnage that is moving is in commodities that could potentially be part of a water move. It just shows the importance of the interconnection between these networks and systems. And then the yellow is basically showing that that commodity is actually going to or coming from a county in Kentucky that has one of the Riverports. And so this is an interesting way of looking at the transportation system within the context of the market that Paul had been talking about. And this will be a significant discussion piece with each of the individual ports, again, as we talk about it more. Next slide. If you take that out to the future, you can see the lines are swelling up. You see a lot of growth overall in the tonnage that is moving. But again, they're not really loads. They're actually tonnages that are moving. But what you don't see is if you toggle, Jimmy, back and forth between 18 and 25 a little bit, what you see is you see, if you go back up to 25 now, just to see the relationship there, what you see is a lot of growth, more growth in the commodities that are not necessarily things that we know that move by truck, by water. So a lot of the truck growth is not going to be in the things that are potentially known to move by water. And a lot of it is not necessarily going to be with the port cities, but the ports are going to have their share. The port cities are going to see, as Paul had talked about, some overall growth in the economy. And we can see that the transportation system is likely to be supporting that, the ground highway transportation system. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into 3D network analysis. That's something that we'll probably do more of when we go out to the individual port cities, or the port communities, I should say. However, what I do want to emphasize is the next steps really in using the analysis that we're presenting here today is we're going to start looking at these flows within the context of a discussion about where do the Riverports see an opportunity to capture potentially some modal diversion when you put these two analyses together. And are there some places where part of the business case related to what we're doing on the highway system or over on the rail system, as will be discussed in the next session, are there places where investments in ports or investments in those other networks become part of the equation for success for the Riverport system? And so we're just starting to really look into the network analysis, and we will again be looking more going into actual truckloads, numbers of trucks relative to truck capacity. And again, there's a whole session at the summit, which is going to be focusing in on specific port locations and access issues. So this is really just the beginning of our discussion about networks. But with that, I'll open to any questions, and also if there are any ongoing questions for Paul, we can address those as well. So I'll hand it back to Jimmy.
Thank you, Chandler. We are at the end of our time. However, be happy to take a few questions if you are able to stay on for a couple more minutes. If you have something to get to, we can let you go. But if there's some questions related to Chandler's presentation, either put them in the chat or we can address them if you want to just turn on your mic and go ahead and ask Chandler the questions. So we'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and then I'll close this up after that, and we'll be wrapped up with our first session of the day. So let's see if there's there anybody that wants to unmute and ask the questions. All right. So Chandler, right now we don't have any questions in the chat, and we're at the end of our time, so people may want to take a break before our next session. So the session following this one this afternoon be from 1:30 to 2:30 Eastern time. It'll be how will the future of freight impact other modal operations, and that will be a panel discussion where we have William Downey, RJ Corman Rail Group. We have PJ Donovan with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we have Tim Kaiser with one of our local authorities, the Louisville. So look forward to that presentation coming session 5 at 1:30. So please rejoin us at that time. We thank you for your involvement this morning and the wonderful presentations that we received from Chandler, Duncan, and Paul Bingham. We appreciate you all taking the time, your busy schedules, to show us the results of those market analysis within the Kentucky Riverports and the other modal movements. So that being said, we thank you, and we'll see you all this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.